Very much. I'm Gino from University of Georgia Deer Lab. I appreciate Mike inviting me today. And I told him right off, I'm not an expert in prescribed burning by any stretch of the imagination. I burned off the garden with my mom growing up, and my wife's the burn boss around the house because she's extremely detail-oriented and organized, which I'm not. I just get really excited. What you see here in these photographs on the left, that's my pack of beagles coming out of a big tangle of blackberry briars and muscadine, and sunlight brings that to us. That's what I look for. When I'm eating my lunch, I get on Google Earth and I look around National Forest and look for areas where I'll see sunlight. Likewise, on the right, you'll actually see my safety belt on the tree there. I'm up in a tree stand. That's one of my favorite places to deer hunt. It's so thick with blackberries on the ground that I shot a deer like 5 feet from that stand. So not only am I a deer researcher, but I get extremely excited about finding habitats that are appropriate for deer. And so what I'm going to talk about today is we're going to provide a little basics on deer ecology and behavior to set the stage for some of what we know regarding how prescribed fire can benefit deer. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a research project in North Georgia that we're just wrapping up regarding declines in deer populations. And we'll provide some insights on how habitat management might be able to help that situation with regards to declining deer. So first of all, deer, they are herbivorous, browsing ruminants. What does that mean? They like to eat plants. Browsing means they're selecting plants that they prefer and the parts of plants that are most nutritious. And as ruminants, they bring in a bunch of groceries and then they run to cover or move to cover and ruminate. They digest that food and then come out for feeding sessions. So what I'm trying to get across is those feeding areas with good nutrition for deer are equally as important as those areas of cover where they can go and digest that food. They're a prey species, meaning that they really require that cover to be able to sort of decentralize themselves, just calm down, put their security system up, use their senses to just relax and minimize their metabolic needs. And so that cover is really important, all brought to you by sunlight. So for deer, nutrition comes in the form of good vegetation brought by sunlight. And of course, prescribed fire can help with that. In terms of social structure, the main hub of a deer population is that doe family unit. You've got your matriarchal doe, that old nanny doe, if you will, and her female offspring. They're with her most of their lives. They set up home ranges adjacent and overlapping to her. They have generally smaller home ranges. So think a couple hundred acres for Georgia deer. And so when you're thinking about burn blocks, think a couple hundred acres that animal's using. So a big burn block can help them, but also smaller burn blocks within their home range can be really important. Males are polygamous, meaning they've got multiple girlfriends during the reproductive season. So they're moving a lot during the reproductive season, that fall rut. They're not eating very much. So leading up to that fall rut, nutrition's really important for them to maintain those larger home ranges to find mates. In terms of behavior, deer are crepuscular. They're moving mainly at dawn and dusk from feeding to bedding areas and vice versa. And they really like edge, those transition areas between, say, mature forest and open areas. So the more edge that we can provide for deer, all the better. And of course, we manage deer as a sustainable, renewable resource. Deer across the range of whitetails are managed generally by recreational hunting, and so maintaining populations that are in good nutritional plane, in good status in terms of biological carrying capacity, not overshooting what habitat's there for those populations, is really important for having quality deer populations. So that main hub that I was talking about, that female, that reproductive female, right now I'm sure, has anybody seen any fawns on the ground this year? Raise your hand if you've seen a fawn out there. I saw a fawn going along Highway 129 following mom already. So those moms, they've got their work cut out for them. I'm seeing a lot of deer along roadsides where we've got closed canopy forest with little sunlight reaching the forest floor. Where you've got those closed canopies, deer can't find vegetation right now to support reproduction. So think about this spring right now. Leading up to the reproductive season, In Georgia, we're talking about fawns hitting the ground May through July. Leading up to that female's trying to recover from winter. She hasn't had a lot of nutrition over the winter. She's lived off her fat reserves. She's carrying fawns. So she's carried these fawns for 7 months. She's growing these little beings within her. Obviously, birth is taxing. And then she's got to immediately lactate. And so she needs sufficient nutrition. If she doesn't have sufficient nutrition, she's going to produce milk of the same quality, but she's not going to have as much volume. If she doesn't have as much volume, one of her twins or triplets may die because of starvation or lack of nutrition for that fawn. During the summer, she's lactating. As soon as those fawns are following her, they're constantly bugging her for milk. Before they're mobile with her, she says, you know what, you go bed over there. I'll be back in a couple hours to feed you. Between those feeding bouts, she's out trying to get adequate nutrition in the form of vegetation to produce enough milk to support her fawns. So she's got her work cut out for her all summer long. Come fall, those bucks are chasing her, trying to breed. So at that time, she's also trying to procure enough resources to put on fat reserves for the upcoming winter. If there's adequate vegetation, great. If there's mast in the form of acorns, even better. But if those resources are limited, she's not going to be able to put sufficient fat reserves on. Of course, then we're hunting these animals at the same time. Come winter, she's bred again. She's carrying these growing fawns within her. During the wintertime, deer tend to have higher parasite loads, drawing them down in terms of their nutritional plane. And in some areas, they have little to no food. And I'm not just talking about the mountains in North Georgia. We can go to some places where we see the biggest deer, like Iowa. Once those crops are harvested, small woodlots, there's very little browse for deer, little woody vegetation, little plant matter for them. So they're relying on their fat reserves to make it through winter. In terms of when these fawns are born, you see this little guy with its mom. As soon as that animal can stand that fawn, it nurses for the first time, and mom puts it to bed and says, hey, go find a little habitat and hide yourself away until our next feeding bout. So these fawns, they're semi-precocial, kind of advanced for their age, if you will. And at day one, they're already designed to outrun predators. But their preferred strategy is to hide. And in order to hide, you've got to have adequate cover, so adequate vegetation. They hide for several weeks. Mom's coming back for these feeding bouts. And then come, in this area, later in July, August, those fawns start to follow mom. They start to learn her habits. Where are those places to feed? So we see bumps early on in the fawn's life, those first 30 days when they're really susceptible to predation, and then another bump 60 to 90 days when they become followers with mom because they're still young and they're making themselves exposed to predators. And by the fall hunting season, they're recruited into the fall population. So that's our annual cycle for deer. And you can see how vegetation in the form of cover and nutrition is so important to promote these fawns into the fall population. I'm a big Elvis fan, if you haven't figured it out. And one of my favorite songs of Elvis is American Trilogy. It includes Dixie and the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But I like to think of, especially in North Georgia, the American Trilogy is the American black bear, coyotes, which are a relatively recent addition to our southeastern landscape, and bobcats. So when those fawns are coming up and those moms are out there trying to get adequate nutrition to lactate and provide for their fawns, they are working around this American trilogy of predators. Think about coyotes. They're a coursing predator. They're on the move all the time. They're looking for protein packages out there in the landscape. If it's a squirrel, great, even better if it's a fawn. And so they're really effective predators in that way. Bears, while mainly they're eating vegetation, soft mass, etc., they're readily taking fawns as well. And bobcats are a very adept predator. And so to navigate these predators, having adequate cover and nutrition is really important. I think about when I growing up in Pennsylvania in the Pocono Plateau, we'd go pick blueberries. You put a coffee can around your neck on a string and you'd pick. Oftentimes bears were on the other side of those blueberry stands. You could hear them, they heard you. They might run off for a little bit, but they're coming back to that soft mast. That's what's really profitable for them, to sit there and feed in a nutrient-dense area. Going out and looking for one fawn here and there is not as effective. but those bears are coming upon these fawns, and some of them, as we've seen in research, including in caribou, some bears are really good predators in terms of they get that search image and they say, you know, forget about those blueberries, et cetera. I'm going to focus on fawns. And so they can really be profitable in terms of predation. Fawning cover is really important. My student Adam Medj, he's sitting out here right there. I always laugh because he's got to get these, you know, these pictures where he's flexing with the fawn. Like, you're going to choke this fawn to death. You don't have to flex the whole time. You still look good in the picture. But what you see is Adam's out there in, you know, an early successional area, an old field setting. That's some pretty good fawn habitat. That fawn tucks itself away. And think about these predators, whether they're coursing or a bear moving through an area or a bobcat that's looking really for squirrels, etc. It's difficult for them to come upon those fawns. Those fawns are very stationary, especially in those good patches of habitat. So between bouts with mom, that fawn's not out laying down a big scent trail that predators are going to find them. And I'm going to tell you a little gross knowledge that you may not know about. Mom comes back, and while she's feeding that fawn, she's also consuming their feces and urine because she wants to reduce that scent signature for predators out in the environment. And so where you have great habitat, like where you see Adam, or you see in the lower middle quadrant, you see an alfalfa field, that's really ideal fawn bedding cover because it's pretty homogeneous, it's difficult for predators to key on certain areas, versus in these upper right photographs, inadequate sunlight, no ground vegetation, those fawns are like sitting ducks. And so vegetation in terms of getting that canopy open, whether it's through, you know, large-scale fires or opening the canopy through timber harvest and maintaining the understory appropriately with prescribed fire can be really beneficial to fawns and getting them out of those first 90 days in particular when they're most susceptible. So transitioning a little bit, I said I wasn't an expert in prescribed fire, but what we did is deer researchers got together and looked at the literature as it relates to white-tailed deer. And you see the one author here, Miranda Hopper. She was an undergraduate student that did the bulk of this work, looking at hundreds of research articles so that we could pull some of the best tidbits about how prescribed fire can benefit white-tailed deer. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. You can see this publication's available on our Warnell at University of Georgia website. But some key points. Well, we know what succession is. It's that change in plant community over time. And as fire managers, you're looking to add that disturbance to landscapes to set back succession. And for deer, that's really important. If you can't tell, that's a deer party hat. That deer, they love to party in areas where they can't be really well seen. That deer, even though his antlers are sticking up above the vegetation, he's happy. He's fat and happy. He's got great bedding cover, and he could take a few steps and he's getting all that browse, all that vegetation that he needs to support himself. So he's got great cover, great friends in that area. And where do we find this for deer? Well, deer are browsers. So as I said, they're targeting nutritious vegetation, particularly woody vegetation and forbs, so broadleaf herbaceous vegetation. We're going to see that in these earlier sears of the successional stages all the way up into mature forest. Now, as a deer manager, I'm going to prefer mature forest that has some openings in its canopy. Think oak savannas. But why are mature forests also important? Well, particularly in North Georgia, where we're going to see that flush of mass that comes down in the fall, in the form primarily of acorns. When deer can get those high energy resources in the form of acorns, they can put on really dense fat reserves, even a couple inches of fat to help them get through winter. But beyond just those acorns, the rest of the year in particular, deer need vegetation from these young forest stages, these shrub stages, to have adequate nutrition to get them through the seasons. And so this party zone for deer preferably has a mix of all of these stages of succession on the landscape and accessible to deer. So thinking about deer at the 300-acre level for a home range for does, or maybe 1 square mile for bucks, you'd like to have multiple burn blocks in an area like that. I realize some of this might be a little bit small for you to see. I just stole it from Vanderloog's publication at University of Missouri, but I'll point at some of the key points I want you to see here. Protein is the most limiting nutrient in natural systems. And what you can see is protein levels in the diet sometimes exceed 20%. And so an adult female lactating during the summer, like we're talking right now, producing large volumes of milk, needs over 20% protein in her diet. I had a litter of puppies recently. I didn't have the puppies. A female had puppies. But I just want to give you an idea what lactation, what the demands nutritionally are. That female beagle was eating 1.5 cups of quality food per day, quality kibble. While lactating, her seven pups in her litter, she required over 12 cups of that same kibble per day. That's an enormous amount. So if you take a deer population and the amount of vegetation that doe's got to put in her bag every day, and you extrapolate it across deer densities that sometimes exceed 30 deer per square mile, in South Georgia, some exceed 100 deer per square mile, we're talking about tons and tons of vegetation to support does. And finding protein-rich vegetation can be really difficult. If I key you over to this area, if we're talking about some areas where we see just closed canopy forest, oak forest in North Georgia, not a lot of vegetation on the ground, during the fall mast season, that mast is only 5 to 7% protein. During the summer, we're seeing protein levels in greenbrier, smooth sumac, blackberries that are 18, 30%. And so natural vegetation can provide these protein levels for females, but it has to be present. And you're not going to see this vegetation without sunlight and without maintenance of that forest floor. We can achieve some of these protein levels with agricultural plantings, again, requiring sunlight and some opportunities for prescribed burning to help in those areas as well. And so as managers, we're the cooks. We're trying to set the table for deer. As a deer manager, I want my deer to be, as I said, fat and happy. I'm going to bed here, and I'm going to take a few steps, waddle my way over to a big food resource. So I'm not expending a lot of energy. I'm putting it more into my antlers, into my reproduction as a deer. And so as we know, fire can set back succession and reduce competition for deer foods. And so we want those forbs, those herbaceous broadleaves, think ragweed. We want to reduce competition for those plants, and prescribed burning can certainly help. We want to enhance species richness, so the number of species on the landscape and the variety. We want a great salad bar like you see right here. And we want vegetation that's low. How many of us have seen browse lines, right? Deer have eaten everything from 0 to 6+ feet. They get up on their hind legs to eat. And that vegetation is not accessible to them. But a good fire plan with a variety of burn blocks can set that vegetation back at a level where it's accessible to deer throughout the year. In terms of deer habitat selection, we don't have to worry about prescribed fire pushing deer out of an area. Certainly a large burn that was, say, 10,000 acres is going to have consequences for a deer that has home ranges only 300 acres to 600 acres. But all of us have probably seen wildlife in recently burned areas, including while the fire is still burning. And deer are no different. In particular, within a couple months, as soon as you see green up, deer are going to return to those areas. Even the least preferred deer foods, when they green up and they're young, deer are going to eat them. There are very few plants that deer won't utilize, and they'll get nutrition from that. And so deer are going to return to these burned areas, but having escape cover is really important, particularly during this spring-summer time frame when we've got fawns on the ground. You see a fawn here from a study in North Carolina in a recently burned area. A coursing predator like a coyote's going to say, oh yeah, I've got my search image down. I just look for these little brown packets, especially the ones with a radio collar on there, and I'm going to go from one to the other like an Easter egg hunt. It's really easy, but if there's some cover, if there's diversity, if there's pyrodiversity in that area, and some areas remain unburned, like wetlands, etc., it provides excellent cover for fawns. This figure that you see on the right, let's see if I can move this. Well, I try to move it and it covers it up more. But what you're looking at here on the right is fawns that starved to death and fawns that lived. So more fawns starved to death in this North Carolina study, the further that they were from areas that had burned due to lightning. So areas that burn due to lightning during the growing season would have had, say the previous season, would have had excellent cover, and the vegetation in that area would have been really nutritious. And in fact, these researchers, they believe that in particular, those recently burned areas due to lightning ignition had greater levels of phosphorus. And think about phosphorus is really a primary component of nutrition in terms of building bones, et cetera, as a young fawn, et cetera. And so those burned areas were really critical for fawns in this system. In terms of the seasons of fire to benefit deer, so as you all know, dormant season burns tend to be more logistically advantageous, and they require longer recovery time. So we can have issues with erosion. Having that extended bare ground is not ideal for deer in terms of cover or even hiding in leaf litter or finding vegetation. But thinking about biodiversity and different burn blocks and having different seasons of fire, different durations of return to fire are really important. Advantages of dormant season burns include enhancing oak regeneration. As we've talked about, mass can be really important. So across generations of deer, having those trees, those oaks being replaced so that down the road we'll have deer that have acorns available to them is really important. Growing season burns can have some advantages. We just talked about those lightning ignition fires that were really important to deer in North Carolina. But having growing season burns too early in the season can certainly compromise fawn survival, or like this Chuck Will's widow that you see right here in the lower right. This is one that I saw while turkey hunting. They're kind of smug little individuals, but they really rely on having some leaf litter on the ground. If we burn that off, that's an issue. So avoiding the reproductive season for animals during the growing season is really important in terms of timing of burn. But growing season burns are going to maximize the quality of forage. So these browsers like deer, they're going to be able to find in a small area high quality forage that's really accessible to them. But again, a case for having different burn blocks and altering the seasonality of burning can be really important because we want our deer to transition really quickly from cover to feeding areas. And when my slide transitions, we'll continue on. There we go. So in this photograph from an area that I sure enjoy to run my dogs in a region that I enjoy hunting in as well, you can see blocks that are set up to have a variety of habitats that are treated in different ways across years. So if we're talking about a 10-year plan, if we've got some areas that are burned on year 1, year 2, year 3, deer are going to be able to transition quickly amongst those burn blocks. Thinking in terms of scale, deer have relatively small home ranges in the southeast. So varying this timing and the size of burn blocks is something that's really important. In terms of combining treatments to benefit deer, I keep harping on sunlight, but without opening that canopy, whether through intense fires or timber harvest, we're not going to see a lot of benefits for deer. But thinning before a fire can really advance the benefits of prescribed firing. Likewise, fire following timber harvest can assist that regeneration, particularly for those oaks that we're talking about that are so important for deer in the fall to put on fat reserves. And I would argue that, like that area that you saw where we're looking at 15 feet of bramble thickets with muscadines, that's a resource that puts thousands of pounds of vegetation on the ground, has advanced resources in terms of cover, great hiding cover to avoid predators, versus some of us like to use food plots. And I'll argue that food plots can really be good in terms of nutrition. What food plots lack, though, is great cover resources. So whether you have food plots in conjunction with natural early successional areas around your food plots maintained through fire, either way we've got to think about where are deer coming from to get to those food plots to feed, and around those food plots, can they access adequate cover in terms of thick vegetation? Burning can help in that sense. Burning can also prepare areas to establish agricultural plantings for deer, or in the sense of this photograph right here, this is a burned off dove field, so that burning can really help in terms of exposing the bare soil that doves prefer and those seeds that are ideal. Likewise, releasing those resources to advance the advantages of food plots through burning can be really beneficial to deer as well. In terms of predators, what we see, I keep talking about these coursing predators, coyotes, and as you'll see from some of our research in North Georgia, coyotes are a really important fawn predator. But pyrodiversity, so providing more edge and a variety of habitats in a small area, is not ideal for predators. Why? It's almost like a maze for them to be able to find those fawns. If we have large areas that are very contiguous and homogeneous, it's easier for those predators to find fawns. So research from our literature review showed that having a diversity of habitats through burning wasn't to the advantage of coyotes and bobcats. Again, I keep harping on this hiding cover and the soft mass component. Think about those blackberries, those blueberries that can be provided. If large predators, including coyotes, have an opportunity to feed on that soft mast and it's very profitable for them, they're not necessarily going to have as big of effects on fawns. And so buffering, as fawns are born, having foods that buffer and offset that predation can be really important. So in conclusion, our literature review about the implications of fire for deer showed that longer burn intervals are really important. I think I may have missed a slide there during that when I was having trouble transitioning, but longer burn intervals in terms of 3+ years for deer habitat's really important. Think about those greenbrier, blackberries. It takes several years for those to be established. Those blackberries in particular are going to provide excellent cover and browse resources for those deer, and it's also going to provide a source of soft mass for predators to buffer predation. Smaller blocks are ideal. I understand as fire managers that's not always ideal logistically, but if you're working on smaller properties, having a variety of timing and diversity of burn regimes is really important. So in this last section, I'm going to transition to our study in North Georgia that we've been working on in partnership primarily with Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and all of our work has been conducted on U.S. Forest Service land. So generally from a deer perspective, mountain environments are kind of poor, and that's why we see national forests on these environments. Some areas are not tillable, really in terms of slope, not ideal for growing agricultural crops. So these primarily public lands across millions of acres are difficult to intensively manage for deer versus small private blocks. So these herds of deer that don't have a lot of access to agriculture or open habitats are mass influenced. We see where deer population numbers and quality are directly influenced by the amount of acorns on the landscape the prior year. As I talked about, these areas can be predator rich, whether from the mountains to the Piedmont. We'll see a variety of predators, so it can be a tough living for deer. The main issue that we saw, the impetus for our research in North Georgia, was declining deer populations based on deer harvest data. So, people travel to the mountains for that mountain hunting experience, and when they don't have an opportunity to see or harvest deer, they're less likely to be on that landscape. They're less interested in being a vested person at the table concerned with management if they're not able to practice their main form of recreation in the form of deer hunting. So we saw vast reductions in deer harvest success from 1979 to 2018. But what we did see was improvements in deer condition. So think about fewer mouths to feed as deer populations decrease. We see some density dependence there, more resources for the remaining deer perhaps. But what we see was low hunter satisfaction. A sister part of what I'm talking about today was to conduct surveys with hunters to understand across time how did they feel about their experience hunting on national forests in North Georgia. And as their success rates decreased, as their ability to see deer decreased because populations were decreasing, their satisfaction and their willingness to return to the mountains also decreased. Across time, just before we started our study in 2015, what we saw, you can see this orange right here, the proportion of natural forest was vastly mature trees, closed canopy conditions, which translates to deer primarily being influenced by those acorn resources. Without adequate sunlight on the forest floor, there would be inadequate vegetation in terms of those browse resources and cover. So indications that habitat might be affecting deer. Our study objectives were to estimate vital rates, so think survival, reproduction, to study these populations that are in decline. And then to use those vital rates to model these populations across time to give Georgia Partner Natural Resources advice about how to change management in this landscape. We conducted our work on Cooper's Creek and Blue Ridge WMAs, so really big WMAs. We're talking tens of thousands of acres, and the interspersed private land between these two wildlife management areas. Again, primarily mature, closed canopy forests. We captured deer in the wintertime across 3 seasons. We put GPS transmitters on them, and so those GPS transmitters on collars transmitted information to satellites. We can download that information to look at deer locations across the year. We could look at, is an animal alive? What habitats is it using? What's its rate of movement in the landscape in different habitats? And what you'll see right here, and my pointer, is a vaginal implant transmitter. So females that received a collar were inserted with the transmitter. When they gave birth, researchers get a signal to say there's a fawn on the ground, and then we can go and collar those fawns, which you see right here in the upper right, and study their survival as well. And so across the course of the study, we were able to collar 59 adult and yearling deer. We captured 70 fawns to study their survival and habitat use. And we were able to track reproduction and survival. And when animals died, we were able to go out and conduct investigations as well as lab necropsies to study what was the source of their mortality. So we're looking at fawn survival. 16% of fawns survive to 12 weeks of age. When a fawn is 10 days old, the vast majority of we humans in this room would never be able to catch those fawns. I'm no track star, but at 2 weeks, 2 weeks old, I've probably never been able to catch a fawn. They are extremely adept at evading predation. But in these habitats, we're seeing fawns that are suffering from predation well across these 12 weeks of age and beyond. What are the sources of mortality? You can see the vast majority of 40% coyotes, 22% black bears, so mainly predators killing these fawns. Failure to thrive. Think about these females that can't adequately produce milk and the consequences for their fawns. How does this relate across the Southeast? With the exception of a study in North Carolina, these are the lowest fawn survival rates we've seen in the Southeast. So deer populations in decline since the 1970s. We're talking about fawn survival at its very lowest. We're talking about closed canopy habitats. So we're starting to put some preliminary information together about what's driving these deer populations. What do we see in terms of adult survival? Very good, except for a few females that are harvested by hunters. And today, in North Georgia on National Forest, hunters can't even harvest female deer because of these population declines. So early in the study, we saw a few deer harvested. Otherwise, by and large, adult deer are surviving. But that recruitment, young coming into the population and being recruited and surviving to the fall hunting population, does not appear to be occurring. We're seeing generally average fawn production rates per doe. So we can put all these into a population model, and what do we see across time? This might be a little bit small for you to see at a distance, but down here would be population stability, this straight line right here. Currently, the observed rate is these populations, as was suggested by harvest rates, are in severe decline. Based on reproduction and survival, they're going to decline. With no antlerless harvest, so no harvesting of the reproductive individuals in a population, the population is still going to decline. You see this blue line right here. We do not see populations that are growing until we have these observed vital rates, so the survival and reproduction that we're seeing right now, but also an increase in fawn survival. So you might say, what are some ways that we might increase fawn survival? Most of them are being eaten by predators. Most of us in this room have probably heard how wily the coyote is, right? Wily coyote is not easy to reduce on the landscape. They are well established. How can we decrease predation on fawns? I hope that after my first ranting early on in this presentation, you'll think sunlight. And how can I, as a burn manager, increase sunlight to increase that cover on the forest floor, increase those vegetation resources for does? So we were able to confirm, we just had harvest data to suggest it, but through this intensive study of studying these deer populations, we confirmed that populations were in decline and in their current state would continue to decline across time. We see really low fawn recruitment into the population. Predation is the main driver of fawn mortality. And Department of Natural Resources has stopped antlerless harvest and still populations continue to decline. So even leaving those big reproductive females on the landscape isn't enough. Fawn recruitment is really the key. And so managing for early successional habitats, young forest, having that cover and vegetation is really important. It's unlikely that we'd be able to adequately control predators, so giving deer the opportunity to feed and hide is really what's important. Sunlight will get us there. And this demonstrates that in some areas of the southeast, deer populations are doing quite well. When we see localized reductions based on harvest data, hunter satisfaction, there's a good case there that populations are likely in decline, and it makes a case for these localized analyses of deer populations. So with that, I want to thank our partners as Georgia DNR, the U.S. Forest Service, and the many people that contributed to this research project. And if we've got time, I'm happy to answer questions. Go ahead, sir.
What would be the optimal, say that 3,000 acre block, how many openings should we have for this?
Well, as a deer manager, I'm going to say wherever you can open up in North Georgia right now, open it up as big as you can, because those deer will adapt. There's plenty of edge there. Even if you knocked out, if you happen to drop a burn on 300 acres that doe happens to occupy, she will move her home range. So the more the better right now. In the future, 100-acre blocks would be great, a third of a deer's home range. But yeah, opening up right now is just the key.
Of your fawns that did survive, what percentage of them were around those private areas that do have that habitat difference versus how many of them survive in the deep dark woods?
Yeah, they definitely find refuge in those suburban areas in pockets. Adam, what do you think? What would you say on average, those that survived, what proportion of them were on private land?
Honestly, it was pretty even. We thought private land would offer more protection because there's more old fields, that type of thing, but honestly, it was pretty, they were getting eaten up everywhere.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's left.
Yeah, it was so limited as far as the old field protection.
I see a question there.
Do you guys in relation to the feeding of corn to deer?
We haven't studied aflatoxins, so fungus in corn, but there have been studies that show that the deer feed corn that's sold at your local retailers has a really high level of aflatoxin, and certainly I wouldn't doubt it's a contributing factor. We didn't see fungal disease though in the deer that we studied here, whether fawns or adults. So, on those wildlife management areas, feeding's not occurring, but those adjacent private lands certainly could. But I'll argue in South Georgia, we've got a ton of feeding for deer, supplemental feeding throughout the year, and those diseases aren't necessarily a big concern. Yes.
What kind of population fluctuations are you seeing with coyotes? Or do you have some disease-driven booms and busts in the population, and can you see that visibly in your fawn survival?
You mean in terms of fluctuations in coyote populations? Yeah, and I'm not a coyote researcher, but I'll tell you what coyote researchers are saying. They are ubiquitous, they're found everywhere, and as soon as a hole is opened up by mortality, other coyotes fill it in. Those transient coyotes are always looking for home ranges to fill in. And so in a landscape like this, I'm certain that coyotes are saturated across that landscape. And I don't know of, distemper or mange reductions at a local scale, but I can imagine those holes that are created are probably filled pretty quickly.
I manage about 300 acres of land that I keep about 200 acres in timber. And I left 60 acres in mature hardwoods just for the wildlife. Was that a smart thing to do if I, was trying to help out the local deer and turkeys?
Well, I think it's really important. As you know, it takes a lifetime for us to get trees that are producing acorns. So having those mature hardwoods is really important. I would say that timber stand improvement in those hardwoods to reduce competition is valuable and to get more sunlight on the forest floor. But even regenerating oaks, so using prescribed fire to improve that seed bed to get regenerating oaks provides a good source of forage for deer as well. And so you can have your oaks and your ground vegetation that's still important to deer, but that sunlight's really important. Having closed canopy oaks or closed canopy oaks with undesirable vegetation in the understory is not ideal. So I think that timber stand improvement can be really helpful.
So on that mature, where the closed canopy is under the oaks, burn that every how many years? Every 10 years?
I think that was the slide that was gone over, but as I read, I don't know what foresters are going to say, but as I read, we do have concerns with scarring of oaks in terms of those that are going to be used for lumber, and we can see advanced mortality of oaks that have prescribed fire applied to them. But prescribed fire certainly has advantages in hardwood systems, but the duration or the interval between fires should be longer. So we're talking 5+ years generally. At least that's what I'm saying. I'm happy to be corrected today, but instead of the 1 to 3 interval that we might use in pine and hard mixed systems, that longer interval would be useful in hardwoods. Yes, sir.
One more, so those areas that we really can't get the whole side, like if we try to thermal thin in certain areas, we're gonna slick off the entire mountain. If we go in and thin mechanically, if we leave, say drop, leave, burn, if we leave that heavy deadened down in those openings, does that affect them?
I think that's a real big advantage as well. Now it depends. If you've got dense stands of mountain laurel and rhododendron, et cetera, that's probably what you're going to have. But leaving those tops is really useful, especially during this time of year when fawns are looking to hide. And those tops are also a nice barrier so that oaks can regenerate and deer can't get to every last seedling. And so leaving the tops, I think, is really helpful. Sometimes you want to clean up using fire, but leaving the tops can be also as advantageous. All right, thank you so much.